Have you ever witnessed someone judge another too quickly, only to deeply regret it later? What happens when the person they underestimated turns out to be the one in charge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. But first, let's delve into this astonishing moment of reckoning. The courthouse always buzzed with noise in the mornings, phones ringing incessantly, hurried footsteps clattering against polished marble floors, and the endless murmur of attorneys, defendants, and clerks weaving through the corridors. Derek Lewis had spent a decade working security here. He knew the rhythm, the flow of movement, the way people navigated the space. He also believed he knew who belonged and who didn't, or so he thought. "Hey, Lewis," Officer Raymond Hale's voice cut through the din as he nudged Derek at the security checkpoint. "You see her?" Derek followed Hale's gaze across the bustling lobby to a woman standing near the elevators. She was black, likely in her late 30s, dressed sharply in a tailored black blazer, fitted pants, and polished heels. She exuded quiet confidence, but there was something in the way her eyes moved, scanning the walls as if searching for something or someone. Derek frowned slightly. "Yeah, what about her?" "She's been standing there for 5 minutes," Hale muttered. "Hasn't asked for help, hasn't checked in. Just looking around like she's casing the place." Derek shifted his stance, observing her more carefully. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but he could already tell. Hale had locked onto her, his instincts kicking into overdrive. And when Hale got that look in his eye, things could spiral quickly. "Could be a lawyer," Derek suggested. Hale scoffed. "That ain't no lawyer." Derek sighed inwardly. "Here we go." "Let's find out," Hale declared, already making his way toward the woman. Derek followed, his face carefully neutral. He had seen Hale jump to conclusions before, stir up tension where there was none. Pushing back never helped. Hale didn't listen. He never did. As they approached, the woman's sharp brown eyes flicked up from the directory on the wall. She turned to face them fully, her expression unreadable. "You lost?" Hale asked, his voice edged with authority. She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Hale folded his arms across his chest. "You've been standing here a while, looking around. If you've got business in this courthouse, you need to check in at the front desk." Derek remained silent, watching her closely. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look defensive. If anything, she looked unimpressed. Like Hale was nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be brushed aside. "And if I don't?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Hale's eyes darkened. "Then we're going to have a problem." Derek swallowed hard. He knew where this was heading. Hale was always looking for control, always trying to flex authority where it wasn't needed. And Derek, he had spent too many years stepping aside, letting Hale do what he did, not because he agreed, but because it was easier. "Sir," the woman said, her voice cool and measured, "this is a public building. I don't have to explain myself to you." Hale's jaw tensed. Derek saw the shift, the tightening of fingers at his belt, the way his stance widened. "Listen, lady. My name is not Lady," she cut in, her tone calm but firm. "And I'd appreciate it if you lowered your voice." A hush settled over the lobby. Conversation stilled, eyes subtly turning toward the exchange. Court employees, attorneys, a bailiff near the doors, all watching. Hale's lips curled into a slow, condescending smirk. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think this is, but you don't walk in here and start giving orders." The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, but you do?" Hale took a step closer, and for the first time Derek moved. "Hale," he murmured, a quiet warning. Hale ignored him. The woman remained still, unwavering. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was just waiting. "You're coming with us," Hale finally declared, reaching for his radio. Derek felt his stomach drop. The woman exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "And what exactly am I being detained for?" "You're acting suspicious." She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Suspicious?" Hale squared his shoulders. "You're loitering in a secured area. You haven't presented identification. You've refused to state your business." Derek's stomach twisted. He had heard this before. He had seen it before. It never ended well. Then, before Hale could utter another word, a panicked voice shattered the silence. "Judge Carter!" A court clerk burst through the lobby, her face flushed, her breath coming in hurried gasps. She nearly stumbled in her rush to reach them. "Your courtroom is ready, ma'am. So sorry for the delay." A crushing, leaden silence fell over the room. Derek felt his throat go dry. Hale's smirk vanished. The woman, Judge Carter, adjusted her blazer with an air of practiced poise. She didn't even spare Hale a glance. Instead, her eyes found Derek's, pinning him with a long, unreadable stare. "I see," she murmured, then turned on her heel and strode away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. No one spoke. No one moved. Derek stood frozen, heart pounding. Hale, still stunned, swallowed hard, his face pale. And in that moment, the weight of judgment fell, not on the woman they had doubted, but on them. She's a judge. Derek didn't respond. His face burned, but it wasn't just embarrassment. Something deeper churned inside him. Judge Carter hadn't needed to say another word. Her silence had spoken volumes, and for the first time in a decade, Derek questioned whether staying quiet had ever truly made things easier. The courthouse lobby remained eerily still. Derek could feel the weight of 100 silent stares pressing down on him, on Hale, on the undeniable reality of what had just transpired. Judge Carter's heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked away, her posture unwavering, her head held high. She never looked back. She didn't have to. Hale's mouth hung slightly open, as if his mind was still catching up to what had just unfolded. He ran a hand over his buzzed blonde hair, his usually flushed skin now pale under the artificial lighting. She's a judge," he finally muttered, barely above a whisper. Derek remained silent, his throat constricted. That moment had arrived, the moment when everything shifts, when the ground beneath you trembles just enough to make you falter. And he had stood there letting it happen. No, he had been complicit in making it happen. Still trying to process, Hale let out a forced, humorless chuckle. "Man, damn, I did not see that coming." Derek shot him a sharp look, but Hale wasn't paying attention. He was too busy forcing another laugh, shaking his head like he was trying to convince himself that it wasn't a big deal. But it was. People were still watching. A few clerks whispered behind cupped hands. A bailiff near the entrance gave them a long, pointed stare before walking away. Even the woman at the front desk had that expression, the one that silently screamed, "That was bad, really bad." Derek exhaled through his nose. "We should get back to work." "Yeah, ... Hale muttered, clearing his throat and adjusting his belt. "Yeah, let's just forget that happened." But Derek couldn't. The rest of the morning dragged, each second heavier than the last. Derek found himself unconsciously watching the elevator Judge Carter had vanished into, his stomach twisting every time the doors chimed open. What if she came back? What if she filed a complaint? He had handled complaints before, but this was different. This wasn't just a complaint. This was power. For years he had seen judges walk these halls, mostly older white men who barely registered his presence. But Carter, she had seen him. And worse, she had let him see. That made it harder to ignore. By lunchtime, Derek couldn't take it anymore. He needed space, needed air. Stepping outside into the courthouse courtyard, he welcomed the warmth of the sun against his skin. But the relief was short-lived. "You got a minute, D?" He turned. Judge Carter stood near a stone bench, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The crisp autumn air tousled the edges of her dark curls, but her stance remained firm. Derek swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew better than to run. "Yes, ma'am," he said, squaring his shoulders. She nodded once, then turned, walking toward a quieter corner of the courtyard. Derek followed, his pulse thrumming in his ears. When they stopped, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she studied him, eyes searching, assessing. Finally, she asked, "How long have you worked here?" 10 years, Derek replied. His voice was steady, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. 10 years, she echoed, her tone unreadable. So you know how things work around here? Derek nodded. You knew he was wrong, she stated. Not a question, just a fact. The weight of her words settled deep in his gut. He could have denied it, could have made excuses. But there was no point. She already knew. Yes, he admitted. Judge Carter exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Then why didn't you stop him? The question landed harder than he expected. Because it was easier. Because he had done it before. Because speaking up meant putting himself at risk. Because he had spent years learning how to survive in this job, and sometimes that meant letting people like Hale do what they did. Derek licked his lips, choosing his words carefully. It's complicated. Carter raised an eyebrow. Is it? Derek let out a slow breath, looking away. He doesn't listen. He never does. And if I push too hard, I'm the one who gets written up, or worse. She studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if she had expected that response. You ever wonder why that is? His jaw tensed. Of course he knew why. Because he was a black man in uniform, working within a system that had never been built for him. Because people like Hale could make mistakes and laugh them off, while he had to tread carefully. Because if Derek had been the one questioning her, the situation might have played out very differently. And yet, he had still let it happen. Carter's voice was steady. I see men like you all the time, she said. Good men. Men who don't want to rock the boat because they know the boat wasn't built for them. And I get it. But let me ask you something, Officer Lewis. When that moment unfolded, when you saw it happening, did it sit right with you? Derek didn't answer. He didn't have to. Judge Carter exhaled, shaking her head, her disappointment quiet but unmistakable. I'm not here to punish you. That's not my role. But I need you to understand something. This courthouse, it's bigger than you, bigger than Hale, bigger than me. And if people like us don't speak up when we see things like that happen, then what exactly are we doing here? Derek felt his chest tighten. She wasn't raising her voice, wasn't scolding him, but somehow that made it worse. Because she was right. And now she was giving him the opportunity to be right, too. Carter glanced at her watch. I have a hearing in 10 minutes, she said. But I'll leave you with this, Officer Lewis. You get to choose what kind of man you want to be in this place. You get to decide whether you're just part of the system or if you're willing to change it. She turned to leave. Derek hesitated, his throat thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, at the last moment, he called out, Would you have filed a complaint? Carter paused, looking back at him, a knowing smile playing on her lips. I didn't need to. Derek frowned. Why? Before she could answer, the courthouse doors swung open. 2 officers stepped outside, their presence shifting the air. One of them, a supervisor, caught Derek's eye and gestured for him to come over. Then Derek saw who they were escorting out. Hale. His expression was tight, lips pressed together in barely contained frustration. One of the officers held a clipboard, and Derek already knew what was happening. Hale had been reported. Not by Carter, but by someone else. Maybe a clerk, maybe an attorney, maybe the woman at the front desk who had seen enough of his behavior over the years. But it had happened. Carter met Derek's eyes one last time. The world is always watching, Officer Lewis, she said, her voice even. The question is, are you? She walked inside, leaving Derek standing there, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. For the first time in a long time he realized he had a choice, and this time he wasn't sure if he could keep looking away. Derek remained frozen in the courthouse courtyard, watching as Hale was led out through the side entrance. The thing that never happened was happening. Hale wasn't just getting a slap on the wrist this time, someone had taken action. Derek had seen too many men like Hale slide by untouched, turning every accusation into a misunderstanding. But this was different. Hale wasn't walking out of here with his usual smirk. He wasn't laughing it off. Derek swallowed hard, his throat dry. This should have felt like justice. So why did it feel like a warning? The afternoon passed in a haze. He went through the motions, checking bags at the security line, scanning ID badges, keeping his head down. But the whispers followed him, the sidelong glances from clerks and attorneys. He knew what they were thinking. Why didn't he stop it? but no one said it out loud. By the time his shift was nearing its end, Derek felt weighed down by something he couldn't shake. He should have gone home, let the day fade behind him. Instead, his feet carried him somewhere else. To Judge Carter's chambers. Her door was slightly ajar, but he knocked anyway. "Come in." Derek stepped inside. The office was smaller than he expected. Just a desk, a few shelves, a window overlooking the city. No grand bookshelves stacked with heavy legal tomes, no unnecessary decorations. Just her, sitting at her desk, flipping through a file. She looked up as he entered, her gaze steady. "Officer Lewis." Derek hesitated before closing the door behind him. "Judge Carter." She leaned back slightly, folding her hands together. "What can I do for you?" Derek exhaled slowly. I just... He ran a hand over his face. "I just wanted to talk." Her lips quirked slightly. "That's a first." He let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I guess it is." Carter nodded, waiting. Derek shifted his weight, then sighed. "Hale's gone." "I know," Carter said simply. Derek frowned. "Did you report him?" She shook her head. "Number I didn't have to." His brows furrowed. "Then who did?" Carter tilted her head. "Does it matter?" He wanted to say yes, wanted to understand why this time was different. "It's just... things like this don't usually happen. Not to guys like him." Carter's expression didn't change. "You mean white guys like him?" Derek stiffened. She hadn't said it with judgment, just fact. He let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Carter leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "You want to know why this time was different?" Derek nodded. "Because enough people saw," she said. "Because enough people were tired of letting it slide. And maybe, just maybe, because men like you are finally starting to ask the right questions." Derek's jaw tightened. "I've been asking questions for a long time." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. Had he? He'd thought about it, felt it. The unfairness, the way the system worked exactly as designed. How he had to move differently, act differently, be careful in ways Hale never had to. But what had he actually done about it? Nothing. He had let it happen. Carter sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You think you're the only one who's had to play the game. Do you know how many times I've been mistaken for the court reporter in my own damn courtroom?" Derek's gaze snapped to hers. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Too many times to count. And every time I had a choice, correct them or let them think what they wanted. I used to let it go, used to smile, used to pretend it didn't bother me because it was easier, because I didn't want to rock the boat." Her eyes darkened slightly. "But you let that go long enough, and one day you wake up and realize you're part of the problem." Derek looked down, hands on his hips. Carter's voice softened. "You're not a bad man, Officer Lewis." He huffed out a humorless laugh. "Doesn't feel like it today?" Carter studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." Derek hesitated. Then slowly he did. She leaned forward. "Tell me something. What do you think happens next?" Derek frowned. "What do you mean?" "With you," she clarified. "You stood there today. You watched it happen. You let it happen. I'm not here to drag you for it. You already know what you did. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Derek exhaled through his nose. He didn't have an answer. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted one.